Okay, so for the lecture from the notes beginning on page, what did we say? 68. Okay, what do Christians call the list of books inspired by God, which they acknowledge as authoritative? What do Christians call the list of books inspired by God, which they acknowledge as authoritative? The helpful information in this particular reading is that there was a process in the Christian church, and those who study the history of the Christian church, will describe the process they went through trying to determine, well, which books are going to be a part of what would eventually become the Bible. And that's what I'm asking is what do Christians call that list of books that they consider to be inspired by God, which they acknowledge as authoritative? Anybody remember from your reading? It's the canon. That's correct. C-A-N-O-N, the canon. And the process was one in which, the Gospels, we said last in one of the earlier lectures, was transmitted through oral transmission. And then at some point, some of these Gospel writers, what we sometimes call evangelists, the word evangel is based on the Greek word for good news, and that's what gospel means. And so they're called evangelists sometimes, and they began to write down these things later. But then we talked about the epistles, and Paul wrote a lot of the epistles or letters. And so those were in the written format right away. And these began circulating around different churches, and they just found them helpful and useful. The early church, whenever they talked about what God said or the Scriptures, they were referring back to the Old Testament because, again, all of them were Jewish in the early church, almost all of them, and they referred, their Bibles were what the Christians refer to as the Old Testament, what some of you are in right now in terms of your Religion 101 class, Old Testament survey. And so that was what they considered as Bible. But as Paul wrote letters, and then as the evangelists began writing down the Gospels, and then the book of Acts came about, then these began circulating, and they began copying them over and over. And we have a reference even in one of the letters by Peter. Peter talks about the writings of Paul, and he says some of his writings are hard to understand, but he says something about how valuable they are, and he says, like the rest of Scripture. So before all of the books were written, Peter was still writing his books. Peter and some others were beginning to refer to Paul's letters as Scripture. And so that process began even with the people that we read about in the New Testament, and then later, after they had died and the church continued to grow, other leaders began to kind of talk about, should we include this book? Let's pull these together. And they call it, and the canon is the list of books that they consider to be authoritative. Canon. Same word as like, a quarterback's arm that we refer to as a cannon, or the gun on a ship. The canon. C-A-N-O-N. Second note. Who may have in fact been pioneers of the early book form which began to replace the scroll during the 2nd century A.D.? Who may have in fact been the pioneers of the early book form which began to replace the scrolls during the 2nd century A.D.? The 2nd century, of course, if you've done any reading at all in history, or if you're a math geek, people get numbers mixed up. But the 2nd century is the 100s, right? So from 100 to 199, that's the 2nd century. And the book format that we're familiar with a bunch of pages pressed together and bound together somehow on one side, began to replace the scroll. And our textbook makes a little allusion to who may in fact have been the pioneers of that form. And someone else. Remember what the book said on that? Book said that Christians probably, it just said may, it didn't say they were, may in fact have been the pioneers. So that's the answer, the Christians. But what that tells us is that Christians place a high emphasis on documents, whether it's scrolls. I read this morning in Luke, or maybe it was yesterday, I can't remember. Luke, Jesus used to go to the synagogues, and they would hand him, in one case in the early chapters of Luke, it said he went to a synagogue to speak, and they handed him the scroll of Isaiah. And so, you see, they preserved documents, and they wrote, and they had a lot of scribes who copied documents, and that part of the Jewish tradition carried over into the Christian tradition, and they had placed a high value on these writings, and they began to eventually pull them together. But Christians, in fact, may have been some of the pioneers of the early book form. Okay. Next question. Who offered for the first time a list of authoritative books identical with the New Testament as we know it? Who offered for the first time a list of authoritative books identical with the New Testament, and when? So there's two questions. Who did it and when? Now, very early on, they had discussions of it. And before the name I'm about to give you, or someone might say, before the name of this individual, other people had other lists that varied a little bit. Some people just said, maybe there were some books that some people considered, I think this is authoritative, and others not. But so it did take a process over a certain period of time, and it would be a legitimate question, just to say, well, okay, when did they finally come up with a list that's essentially identical to the 27 books that we've talked about in here so far? And this is on page 72 in the Zondervan Handbook of the Bible. And that person who offered for the first time the list of authoritative books identical to the New Testament is Athanasius. 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 And anybody find that already? And tell me the date. What was the date that he did that? AD 367. That's correct. So, several centuries now, again, many people use these books that are in the New Testament. From the time they were written, they began, being circulated and copied and circulated and copied, and so there were a lot of scribes, and many dedicated themselves. And as we mentioned last time, other scholars who study other manuscripts are very jealous of New Testament scholars because we have thousands of manuscripts, and sometimes they're just little pieces, fragments. There's a fragment to the Gospel of John that goes back, into the 1st century, and so we've got some very ancient and old fragments and documents, and because they did a lot of copying, so they were in use, and yet as they began to meet together and discuss, and of course they were believers, and so they would pray and ask God to give them wisdom and help them to know which books should they kind of bind together. And so that was Athanasius in 367. Now, the next question is kind of has to do with, what criterion did they set up? So here's the way I have it worded. What are the 4 key concerns that resulted in usage and acceptance of a book as being authoritative? What are the 4 key concerns that resulted in usage and acceptance of a book as being authoritative? And so you just need to list these, and you want to be able to understand them, so you might take a few notes, but you don't have to have several paragraphs for each one, but you might just make a few notes. So based on your reading or looking at the book even now, who can tell me one of these 4 key concerns? Apostolic. Okay, let's talk a little bit about that one at the beginning. Apostolic means it has a connection to one of the apostles. And that was important to them. If they felt like the document had a close connection with one of the apostles, then that was in the book, in the favor of that particular book. Now, Jesus called how many people to be basically his close followers? 12, and he called them disciples, we'll see. Disciple means like a student, a learner, a follower. But then he also called them apostles. Apostles based on the Greek word that means to be sent forth. And so an apostle is essentially like a missionary. An apostle is someone that is sent forth with a message. If I was speaking in Greek and I was just saying, I'm going to send forth my daughter to the gas station to fill up the car, I would say apostello would be the verb that I would use. And so it didn't always mean someone that was sent off, with a, to do something, or especially if I had a little thank you note for her grandfather, and I said, take this over to Papa's house, and give it to him. Then I would be sending her off with a message. So it's just a common word that was used. But of course, we think of it as in the religious context because in English we don't say apostello, we say sent forth. So that's how apostle and came to be known as a religious term. But the English word that's really a little bit more familiar with us that says the same thing is missionary. So they were like missionaries. Now, not all of the 27 books of the New Testament were actually written by apostles. So it doesn't mean that they had to be written by apostles, but they had to have a strong connection. We're going to notice when we get into the Gospels that not all 4 Gospels were written by disciples. Okay, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Which ones were not disciples? Anybody know? Matthew was and John was, so Mark and Luke were not. But, Luke spent a lot of time with Paul, and Paul spent some time with the apostles. Mark spent a lot of time with Peter, and so they have those kinds of connections. And then, of course, Paul wrote many epistles. There's the book of Hebrews. We'll talk about that. In early times, probably when they were going through this process, some of them thought that Paul wrote Hebrews. But most scholars today, even scholars that are strong believers and Christians and very conservative and believe the authenticity and accuracy of the Bible, many of them don't believe Paul wrote Hebrews because the author of Hebrews never identifies himself. So or herself, I guess. Some people have suggested maybe Priscilla wrote it, but we don't really know who wrote Hebrews. But nonetheless, so it's not like all of these tests have to be definite, but all of these tests either help move a book toward being accepted or sometimes move a book away from being accepted. Okay, who was that? Rachel that identified that one? Someone else identify what's another of the key concerns?
Orthodox.
Okay, what does orthodox mean? I mean, there's an Orthodox church. If you've studied in Religion 107, the textbook for that, Coogan's textbook, Introduction to Religion, it talks about Judaism and Christianity and Islam and Hinduism, Buddhism, Chinese, Japanese religions. Those are the 7 chapters. And when you look at Christianity, it breaks it up into 3 broad categories: the Roman Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church, and the Protestants, basically. That's one way of dividing up. Now, in our area, we don't have a lot of Orthodox churches in our, I grew up in Las Cruces and lived in Fort Worth for a long time, and El Paso and here. So I don't remember seeing too many Orthodox churches. I think there was an Orthodox festival they used to have in El Paso. People used to love to go get Greek food there and stuff. So, but, what does Orthodox mean? Anybody know just in general? Orthodox means kind of like according to the truth or according to what has been accepted. So like if someone comes up with a new idea, someone might say, well, that's not very orthodox, something like that. So in other words, as they were trying to decide which books to include in the New Testament, they said, it had to be orthodox, it had to be accurate, it had to be consistent with what they really thought, was the teachings of Jesus. Now, recently, sometimes someone will find an old document, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Judas, things like that, and especially before the academic community has time to do a lot of research on it, it's been popular for someone to write a book or make a movie or something, and there's a window of time which you can make a lot of money on things like that before the academic community and people who take time to do research and to submit their ideas to peer review. And it doesn't matter if you're in criminal justice or psychology or what you're in. This is the process. This is why people just can't go say things like, hey, I think that if we start encouraging 12-year-olds to commit suicide, I think it'll help the society. Well, if a psychologist or someone put that out there, other people would analyze it, and if a scientist said, if we do this to these types of cells, this happens, and other scientists can do the same thing, and that's peer review. That's what academics do. And so, but oftentimes these things that make big money on a movie or a popular book, that doesn't bear up under academic scrutiny, and so they only last a little while, and they're just a flash in the pan, and then they're gone. And so you've heard of other documents, and sometimes people think, oh, well, the church, people love conspiracy theories, and so they think, oh, the church is worried about this got out, and the church killed all the people that knew about it, so that no one would find out, or stuff like that. That makes good movies and sells books too. So, But in fact, they knew about these books, and they looked at them and they said, these are not orthodox. This one claims to be written by Paul, but we know that in fact we can tell because here's a reference to the destruction of this particular temple, and this happened after Paul died, and we all know that. So sometimes the church, they were smart enough to figure out that some of these things were lies. They were not written by who they said they were written by, or they just felt that they looked at the teaching and they said, well, we've got Matthew's gospel, and we still have some eyewitnesses. Early on, they had eyewitnesses, and they said, we know what Jesus taught, and this is contradictory to this. This is more of the things that they've been talking about down in Egypt. Someone in Egypt wrote this and said Jesus said it. And so they threw a lot of those things out early on because they weren't orthodox. Okay, someone else. It had to be apostolic. It had to be orthodox. What else? Catholic. Okay, now when we hear Catholic, of course, we think of St. Helens, right? We think of whatever Roman Catholic Church is near where we grew up or where we live. But Catholic means universal. So this is not a reference to saying that part of the Roman Catholic Church developed later, of course, and so think of Catholic as being the church at large. And especially if you see Catholic in a lowercase c, then it's an adjective. It's not referring, and oftentimes when in Christian history books and books about biblical interpretation, if they're talking about the Roman Catholic Church, they'll use capital R Roman, capital C Catholic, Roman Catholic Church. So that it had to be one that didn't just. There might have been some letters that they thought, well, this is a good letter, this is a good document, but it really only applies to this particular situation that the Christians in Ephesus are talking about. It refers to what to do. In Ephesus, there was a temple of Diana, if I remember right, and it was a Greek goddess, and there were thousands of cult prostitutes. And maybe there was a little document written to help the church to know how to something about that city. Maybe there was a women's group that figured out a way of introducing Christ, as described in the New Testament, to some of these temple prostitutes in Ephesus. And they found that many of them were appreciating what they were learning. And so, but that really doesn't apply to all the cities. It doesn't apply to all the churches. It's not Catholic. You see what I mean? And so that's what the Catholic idea is. The letters that they decided to keep were apostolic and orthodox and also Catholic. And someone, the last one? It's not really a one-word description of this one the way I have it. What does it say in the book?
Has nurtured the life of the churches over time.
Yeah, I just put that whole phrase, just like Kyra said it, nurturing to the life of the church over time. Nurturing to the life of the church over time. You see, the purpose of the Scriptures, again, the things that the Scriptures, the people enjoy them today are the same reason that people use them then, is that they have questions and they feel like they're getting answers from them. They have, they have needs, and they feel like, they're getting true wisdom and comfort and strength and inspiration from them. And so that's why some things got circulated even before they were recognized as being scriptures. That sometimes they just said, "Hey, have you read the letter that Paul wrote to the church in Galatia?" The church is in the Galatian region. Galatia wasn't a city; it was more of a region. But man, it's exactly what we were talking about the other night. And so let's try to get a copy of that. And so it was nurturing and helpful within the churches. Okay. Now we touched on this already, so this should be easy. And if you were here Tuesday, I think, is when we talked about this. But what was the original language of the New Testament documents? Greek. For New Testament, you want to make that distinction for it. That's Greek. Hebrew. People often say Hebrew and Greek, and that's probably because they've been asked the question, "What's the original languages of just the Bible in general?" But the Hebrew is the Old Testament. And in fact, if you have any interest in the Old Testament, we have in here a book you can look at. This is published by Orthodox Jewish people, not Christians. And this is their Bible, so it's very similar to the Old Testament, but basically it's the Jewish Bible. And I have one in Hebrew if you want to see the Hebrew, but this has a few Hebrew letters, but most of it's in English. But the books are in a slightly different order than the Christian Old Testament, but it's remarkably similar in terms of the books that it's contained and the divisions and so forth. So, but for the New Testament, we're talking about Greek. And I do have some Greek New Testament, if you'd like to see that. And if you're considering doing graduate work in Bible, then you might consider taking Greek and Hebrew. They are offered here at Eastern as well as at a lot of other universities. Okay, now here's a little bit to know about the Greek. It's a common Greek. You don't have to know the word koine. Some Greek scholars call it Koine Greek, but it's just the common Greek, the language spoken by many people around the Roman Empire at the time of Jesus. When scholars first began to study Greek and they didn't know a lot about the other Greek culture, the Greek language is very precise. It's very colorful. It's very vivid. Some people have described it as like being able to communicate in color. When I was in graduate school, someone said it's like color compared to black and white. Okay, of course now I would be more to say something like it's like high definition compared to to black and white or something. So it's a very vivid language. In fact, some people thought that maybe it was a language that some Christians and biblical scholars thought that maybe it was a language that God only used to communicate the New Testament only. But then biblical archaeologists and Middle Eastern archaeologists began to find inscriptions and documents and receipts and contracts and all sorts of things, just from the times. And they began to realize this is the same Greek that the New Testament scholars have been studying, on all their fragments. And they began to realize that this was just the common language of the day. And it was just a very vivid, colorful, communicative, a language in which you could communicate very clearly and precisely. And so Greek in general, but it's not a special Greek. It was spoken by many people around the Roman Empire at the time of Jesus. Okay, now concerning the translation of the Greek New Testament into languages today, here's a note that came from the textbook, and I think this was a 2007 edition, and it said, and here's my question, of the 6,912 languages known worldwide, what percent have the full Bible? So, you may not have known about how many languages, and perhaps linguists have identified some more since 2007. That would not be surprising. But anyway, about 7,000 languages. And of the of the 6,912 languages known worldwide, what percent have the full Bible? Did someone find that? Okay, only 5%, not many. So there are a lot of organizations that that feel like the New Testament is so valuable and helpful for reasons we've already talked about and will continue to talk about. That many organizations and people dedicate their lives to translating the Bible into more and more and more languages. So possibly the 5% is also higher since that fact was given. But oftentimes before they have time to translate the whole New Testament, or the whole Bible, as was said in this particular question, they have time to translate fragments of it. So oftentimes they'll take one of the books of the New Testament, like John is oftentimes the first one translated, and they'll translate the book of John into one of these new languages. So here's the second question that's kind of together with that one. I have them in the same note. What percent of the world's population have at least some part of the Bible in a language they know? What percent of the world's population have at least some part of the Bible, probably a New Testament book, at least some part of the Bible in a language that they know? Well, the answer is well over 90%. So only 5% when this statement was made had the full Bible, but over 90% had at least some portion of the Bible. So that's so there are translators and organizations like Wycliffe Translators is a very well-known one historically, named after a man who was executed in England because of his feeling that the common people should be able to have scriptures available to him, and the powers that be at the time felt like that was not appropriate, and so he was burned at the stake. So there's a translation organization named after him. Yes?
On the first part about the 6,902 languages, my book says 6%.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. It could be a modification. Let me go ahead and change my notes. So 6% is what the book has?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Either I just flat copied it wrong in the first time I did it, or I just was looking at an older note. But I think I have the same edition you have, so I probably just flat copied it wrong. Thank you. Okay, good. Let's see now. Okay, we talked about this a little bit yesterday, but I don't think you had it in your notes. So let's go ahead, and I have it in my notes already for this lecture, so let's go ahead and put it in. There's two different types of translations, and we'll talk about them from time to time. And so again, this is knowing a little bit more. Again, even if you had very little information or knowledge of the New Testament prior to the course, looking at it from an academic setting will kind of, sometimes you'll find that you know things that people who have read the New Testament several times don't know, just because of an academic and a formal study of it. Here's one of those things in terms of how different translations, and we're talking about English translations now, but the same could be said of translations in other languages. There's two different types of translations. There's a word-by-word translations. They focus more on the original language. And my question is going to be, what are some examples of word by word? And so I'll give you some examples. But you need to know that word by word translations focus more on the original language. In other words, for the New Testament, they focus on the Greek heavily. And they can sound a little bit strange, but they can reveal the original structure. You see, grammatical structure is not the same from one language to another. And so a word-by-word translation is not so worried about having real silky smooth English. They're very worried about making sure that they convey almost exactly what the Greek, so they try to do a word for word. Now, you can't do a perfect word for word, because in one language they might have one word that can be translated 20 different ways in another language, and then they might have 7 or 8 words that all seem to be translated to be one word. And so it's just a really difficult task, and if you know people that are good at translating, that's really something to be admired, because some people can just get up and translate, for like Spanish to English in a chord or something like that, or in church services, and that is not near as easy as you might think. But some people are very good at it, and some people just spend a life studying how to do this. So word by word translations, word for word, That's their goal, and they focus heavily on the original language, and they're trying to keep the same structure as much as possible, that grammatical, syntactical structure. Some examples are, and here's the question, what are some examples? And this is what I want you to know, and you don't have to memorize all these, but the ESV is the one that I probably will read the most when I want a literal translation, because it's new, and it's fairly new. I mean, I don't know, 10 or 15 years or something. Another very popular one is the NASB, the New American Standard Bible. That's a good one. Of course, what's probably the most famous English translation ever? The King James. So that's, King James Version, KJV, if you see. And of course, people who are familiar with these, they just use the abbreviations and they expect everybody to know what they mean. But ESV and NASB is the English Standard Version, the New American Standard Bible, the King James Version, and then within the last couple of decades, they came out with the new King James Version. So it was very similar to the King James Version, but it reflected some of the things that have been discovered in terms of manuscripts and things since the King James Version was written. The King James Version was translated or actually published, made available in 1611. And it has been a fantastic translation. Many people have learned everything they know, essentially in their lives about, the New Testament period and what it teaches through the King James Version. But it is old, and that's why there's a lot of new translations that are very popular, because they're a little bit clearer. And the King James Version reflects the English that was spoken in 1611, which is not the same as how the English is spoken now. Okay, the other one, other than the word-by-word translations, there are thought-by-thought translations. So instead of focusing on the original language, they focus on the target language. So a thought-by-thought translation, it obviously takes the Greek very seriously, but it really focuses heavily on the English. In other words, they're going to make sure that the English is smooth, that the English is very understandable, very readable, very clear, and that's a thought-by-thought translation. So instead of thinking so much in terms of doing a word-by-word, they're doing more thought-by-thought, and they're going to make sure that it's very good English, or very smooth, or very... Now, they can be very smooth, but they sometimes hide the original structure. You might have several sentences, and you might think, oh, there were several sentences here. Well, no, they just decided to translate it several sentences. Actually, in Greek, it's one long sentence or something. You see, and I think there's a place for both of these. Sometimes when someone is new to the New Testament and they haven't read it much before, and they try to read the King James Version, or I've even noticed, I've been reading the ESV again this year, and there's places where it sounds like it's a little bit awkward. It's just kind of like you get stumbled up in reading it. It just doesn't flow. But I still like it because I'm interested in what the Greek looked like. And I've taken Greek, but I haven't stayed as current enough in my Greek to just pick up my Greek New Testament and read it. So I like it, but it's a little bit like that. But for someone that's new, I wouldn't recommend that, because some people have said, I picked up the Bible and I tried to read it and I didn't understand. Well, part of that could just be the grammar, and so here's some examples of the thought by thought. I'll just give two. The NIV has been the most popular in decades. The NIV, New International Version, NIV, and another one that's pretty popular and good is the NLT, the New Living Translation. Back when I was your age, there was a guy named Kenneth Taylor that just decided that his kids could not understand the Bible, so he was going to paraphrase the Bible so that his kids could understand it. He did such an awesome job that they published it, and it sold millions. It was called the Living Bible. Now that's called a paraphrase. When one man just decides to, essentially put the Bible in his own words to help maybe his congregation or his Bible study or his kids or whatever. But it was very, very popular. But later, a team of scholars got together and they said, in the spirit of what Kenneth Taylor did with the Living Bible, let's make a translation. The translation is not just one man putting it in his own words. It's a team of scholars who study the original language, and they say, and yet they still did it thought by thought. They didn't do it word by word, and that became the New Living Translation. The church that I worked at in El Paso used to buy lots of New Living Translations for the children's ministry because the kids could understand that. It was a thought by thought. It wasn't hard to understand. And also sometimes the translators will say, let's make this at a 5th grade reading level. They have to decide what kind of vocabulary they're going to use and how much diversity within the vocabulary, because they want people to understand it or whatnot. And there's just lots of different translations. We had a mission group that went to Hawaii, and there's a Pidgin translation, that talks the way people talk in Hawaii using what they call Pidgin. And there's all sorts of translations, but a lot of times they're paraphrases. But scholars use these quite frequently, and so you should have some familiarity. But you can't know about all the translations. There's just too many. All right. Next note. All right, in the essay on pages 83 to 85, and you'll notice in the handbook that the guy and his wife that are noted as the authors, they didn't write the whole thing. They got a lot of people to write little essays all throughout it. And so in fact, the man is dead, and only his wife kind of made some revisions for the last edition. But anyway, so. You can't always refer to them being the author, because like that essay, there's an essay on pages 83 through 85 that say Jesus in a Pluralistic Society. And I think that's a good essay because, of course, people talk about how pluralistic our societies are, and that is true. But sometimes we feel like in ancient times they wouldn't have known anything about it. Well, sometimes in ancient times, if we actually go back and look at them, there were situations in which people did a lot of traveling, and there was a lot of pluralism in some places more than others. But especially port cities, there would be a lot of people coming and going, and sometimes with military campaigns, and even back in the Old Testament, when Assyria defeated the Israelites, and they took, what they would do is take Israelites from one place and move them to another, and take people from other nations they defeated and moved them into Israel, and so they were mixing people around at the same time. And so we did get a lot of pluralism at certain times and in certain places. And so, but in our society, of course, it's pluralistic. There's a lot of different cultures and values and languages and all sorts of things. Foods, that's a good part, that get, experienced in different places. So what are the implications drawn out of the early hymn in Philippians 2, 6 through 11? In the essay, what are the implications drawn out of the early hymn in Philippians 2, 6 through 11? So we're going to go ahead and read that hymn. And again, this is just a passage right out of the New Testament. Paul wrote many letters we've talked about, and we're going to read in Philippians chapter 2. And so he wrote to some people in Philippi, and the beginning of the letter, he says, Paul and Timothy, to all God's holy people in Christ Jesus at Philippi. And so we call this Philippians. And you can find on maps, these cities that are described in the New Testament, almost all of them can easily be found. Archaeologists have identified them. And history took place from the time this was written up until now. History has been moving forward. And so these are not lost cities. These are not, if you read a novel, little kids sometimes read novels, and the author will put a little map in the front because it's an imaginary land. And if they don't realize that it's an imaginary land, they might be asking their dad, where's the green, where's the Emerald City, where's this and where's that, But archaeologists have found, so when you read the New Testament, and you read about, Jerusalem, it's the same Jerusalem that's in the news all the time, today. And when you read about Damascus and some of these places, it's the same one. History, there's not any big gaps in history that we don't know it. Occasionally there's a smaller town, or there might be some different opinions about whether, this is the real site of Jericho or things like that. But for the most part, there's a lot of continuity and a lot of consistency in the historical and archaeological record. So Paul wrote to Christians in Philippi, and beginning at verse 6, linguists who study the way language is used, they feel like this was most likely a hymn that was used early on. And there's a lot of scholars, even scholars that are not very certainly not what you'd say conservative believers. They acknowledge that this was a very early hymn that the Christians must have sang. So those are the kinds of things that graduate students and scholars talk about, is how accurate things were, or how early different parts went. And so also you can sometimes tell in your translations, sometimes it'll just be justified, right and left side, you'll just get a column of material, and then it'll break down to where it's all kind of jagged. Well, oftentimes that's when it's hitting a poetic section. And so the poetry is hard to translate from one language to another, but you do get the idea, like when you're looking at the Psalms in the Old Testament, that you get the idea that why did they not go to the end of the line? Well, they were starting over because it was a poem, and that was the next line of the poem. Okay, so here's what we're reading.
What version are you reading?
I'm going to start with verse 5 of Philippians chapter 2.
In what version?
We'll do the NIV. That's what I have here open. So, okay, Paul says, in your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on a cross. Therefore God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. So most of Paul's letters don't read like that. Most of Paul's letters read like, about the things you wrote about, these are my suggestions. And he's just like talking to them. But this reads a little bit more kind of like a psalm, although it's clearly based on New Testament understanding of what has happened and what we call New Testament theology, the study of God. And so here are some of the implications in terms of answer to our question, what are the implications drawn out of the early hymn? Number one, Jesus offered men and women unconditional forgiveness for their sins. Jesus offered men and women unconditional forgiveness for their sins. That has been a significant, key in why people feel like it's so important to translate the New Testament into so many languages. For those that accept the message in the New Testament, they feel like it's good news that people who the New Testament we're gonna see in Romans, that the New Testament teaches that all people have sinned. All people have chosen to basically rebel against God, even though they may not frame it that way, but that would be one way of describing it. And this particular passage talks about, one implication is that Jesus offers men and women unconditional forgiveness for their sins. Complete forgiveness. There's not, some people feel like, if you just told some white lies, I can see that maybe you could be forgiven for that. But as I said last week, some people feel like I could never be forgiven for what I've done. In the Bible, there's some of the people that are known as heroes in the Bible, that some of them were murderers, some of them had committed adultery, like King David in the Old Testament. And in the New Testament, in the book of Acts, David is called a man after God's own heart. The New Testament describes a God who is extraordinarily generous in terms of his forgiveness. It doesn't describe a God that just says, I'm just going to forgive everybody and let everyone into heaven. It's not like that, because there's a justness to his character as well. But in terms of those who will accept the sacrifice that Christ made, doesn't matter what their history is or their past, the Bible, the New Testament, the message of the New Testament is that they will forgive them. God will forgive them through Christ. Where there is repentance and acceptance, there is forgiveness. Where there is no repentance, then there's no forgiveness. But there is unconditional forgiveness available to all people, according to the New Testament. Second implication. Jesus presented himself also as the one to whom all nations will give an account at the end of history. Jesus presented himself as the one to whom all nations will give an account at the end of history. Jesus presented himself as the one to whom all nations will give an account at the end of history. Jesus, the first one, again, just to review, Jesus offered men and women unconditional forgiveness for their sins. Number 2, Jesus presented himself as the one to whom all nations will give an account at the end of history. Now, as we said before, people who are not very familiar with the New Testament, it's kind of popular to say, well, I think Jesus was a good man. And all they're really saying is that if you're a Christian, I'm trying not to offend you. Okay? And that's kind of nice if they don't want to offend Christians. But it's really not very logical. It breaks all the laws of logic, to say that that's a New Testament position. It's not a New Testament position because would a person who's just a man and doesn't claim to be God, doesn't claim to be, anything other than a normal human being who maybe is a good teacher, would he say that all the nations will have to give an account to me at the end of history? No, he wouldn't, right? Not unless he was crazy. And so, from the New Testament standpoint, Jesus couldn't really have been just a good man, but not God, because of the claims that he made. And we'll see those in the Gospels. This is kind of written about Christ, what maybe the early Christians began to say in terms of poetry and hymns about him. But that's what we see here. That all nation, that every knee will bow before him and every tongue confess that Jesus is Lord, and this is touching on themes that we'll read throughout the New Testament. Now, there's a third implication. The third implication after Jesus presented himself as the one to whom all nations will give an account at the end of history. The third one brought out in the essay there is. At the heart of the first disciples' faith and preaching lies the claim that Jesus was resurrected by God. At the heart of the first disciples' faith and preaching lies the claim that Jesus was resurrected by God. They emphasize the cross, and we're going to notice several times throughout the Scripture. And this is the essay that's on that page. Again, it's not so much taken right from this particular. It's not all drawn right from this particular hymn, but it all is. We'll see several times within the New Testament. Okay, now there's a part of the reading for today that talks about. Women in the New Testament, and it kind of looks at some of the Old Testament characteristics of Judaism, and compares that to Christianity, specifically how it might apply to women. So here's my next question, kind of in that vein. It is true that in the Old Testament, women were excluded from priesthood. I'm going to read the whole thing, and then I'll go back and give it to you a little bit at a time so you can get it all in your notes. It is true that in the Old Testament, women were excluded from priesthood, as were some men also. But what does the New Testament teach about priesthood? So that's the essential question. What does the New Testament teach about priesthood? But the front part of it, in the Old Testament, priests were only men. In fact, not all men. Some men, if you were... if you had a deformity or some certain things, there's some passages in the Old Testament that say that you could not serve as a priest. So only certain men, in fact. But what does the New Testament teach about priesthood? Well, I don't have a page number here. I don't. If you identify it, let me know. Maybe but what the New Testament teaches, specifically in 1 Peter, is the priesthood of all believers. The priesthood of all believers. So that includes, of course, men and women. That all those who believe in Christ are considered part of a new priesthood, a nation of priests. It's described in the New Testament. Again, 1 Peter would be a place that you could find specific examples of that. Now, let me just real quick remind you that I mentioned websites that help you to find things in the Bible, and that you don't need to go out and buy a New Testament. If you've got, the smartphone, you can just go to YouVersion, download the YouVersion app, and if, like, for instance, if you said, I've read the New Testament, I don't remember anything about the priesthood of the believer. Where is that? And if I can't remember where it is, I can go to blueletterbible.org. It's one of many sites. That happens to be my favorite, just because I just got to using it and got used to it. But Blue Letter Bible, and I gave you that in the first day, blueletterbible.org, and it's like a concordance. A concordance is back before the internet. We had concordances, big books. They still have them, of course. And you could look up priesthood, and it would tell you every place in the Bible where priesthood occurs. Well, of course, now people do most of that online, and I can just type in priesthood and tell it to search, and it'll quickly give me every place in the Bible where priesthood occurs. Or I could even put priesthood and believers, to try to find, to see if there's a verse. And sometimes there's phrases we use that are not in the Bible, but there's verses that talk about them, like Trinity. We'll talk about the Trinity later on. The word Trinity is not in the Bible, but there's a lot of verses that talk about the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. Okay, next question. And this one has an introduction about the Old Testament as well, so I will read it quickly, and then I can read it again as long as anybody would like me to. I'll repeat it and read it slower. But here's the full question. In the Old Testament, circumcision was the sign of belonging to God's covenant people. But in the New Testament, what is the sign of belonging to the covenant community for both men and women? Of course, in the Old Testament, they did circumcision. Circumcision was cutting off the foreskin of the male penis. There was no circumcision for women. Now, there were actually some cultures and people had mutilation rites where they did cut, part of the woman's anatomy. But the Jewish people did not practice that. But still, here was a sign that was identifying the Israelites as being God's people. Their willingness to undergo this sign as perhaps a symbol of, the cutting off of all that was evil or wicked or something like that. But it was only for men. It was almost like, oftentimes in ancient times, women were considered like property. I mean, it's very recently in history that women were able to vote and things like that. And so, of course, it varied a little bit from culture to culture, but in many cultures, it was just a man's world. And so it's a little bit different. In the New Testament, what is the sign of belonging to the covenant community? Baptism. Baptism. Baptism is an event, and both men and women are baptized. Baptism is an event where originally, I feel like some people will debate this, but originally men and women, they had a pool of water, or they went down into the Jordan River or something, and they would lower a person under the water and then bring the person back up. And so today, in fact, last semester and over the break, 9 different ENMU students were baptized in churches around. This still happens. I think that I've heard this semester 2 more ENMU students who are going to be baptized in local churches. So, this still happens. This baptism is the sign of the covenant. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. But again, it's something both, in fact, of the students that I'm thinking of last semester, they were about, half men, half women. But they were, students who wanted to say, hey, okay, I want to, cross the line. I want to be a part of this group. I want to, I believe, I want to be a follower of Christ. And in the Old Testament, circumcision was the sign of belonging to God's covenant people. But in the New Testament, what is the sign belonging to the new covenant people? It's baptism. And symbolically, what it represents is you're kind of dramatizing the burial and the resurrection of Christ. You're saying, I want to follow Christ. Well, how can you do that? Well, of course, there's a lot of ways you do that. But one way of kind of showing the world that, a public way, because people are baptized usually with other people around, is to get baptized. And so when the pastor or whoever lowers you into the water, like I got to do this. I was one of the one baptizing one of the ENMU students, and under the water and then back up, and that was symbolizing that he was following Christ. Not only was Christ baptized, But Christ, of course, was buried and then raised, and so the baptism kind of just shows that figuratively or in a picturesque way. Okay. There's still about 3 of you that haven't done the online assignment, so make sure to go on Blackboard and look at the syllabus and see if you have any questions on that, and get back with me. I'll see you next time. Thanks for your attention.